The security guards' boots crunched through fresh snow as they dragged Rebecca Mitchell and her hours-old daughter toward the iron gates, but the young mother's silk hospital gown offered no protection against the December storm that mirrored the coldness in her husband's eyes. Daniel Ross stood in the marble doorway of the Ross family mansion, the same mansion his parents, siblings, and cousins had worked their entire lives to afford through their positions at Meridian Global Industries, the $80 billion corporate empire that employed 3 generations of his family. But he had no idea that the trembling woman he was casting out was actually Rebecca Thornton, the secret daughter of billionaire Edmund Thornton, the very man who owned every building the Ross family had ever stepped foot in, every paycheck they'd ever cashed, every opportunity they'd ever received. The blonde woman in designer heels standing beside Daniel, his mistress Victoria Lang, threw her head back with laughter that echoed across the snow-covered grounds as Rebecca stumbled and nearly dropped her crying newborn. But that cruel sound would be the last moment of joy Victoria would ever know, because what Rebecca did next wouldn't just shock Daniel and destroy Victoria's dreams. It would devastate the entire Ross family and expose secrets that would unravel everything they thought they knew about power, loyalty, and the woman they'd treated like garbage. Daniel believed he was throwing out a broke, worthless wife who'd trapped him with a pregnancy, but he was actually destroying the one person who held his family's fate in her hands, and neither he nor his laughing mistress could have imagined that the shivering woman in the snow possessed the power to erase them all with a single phone call. So why had Rebecca hidden her true identity? What had she seen in Daniel that made her choose poverty over privilege? And what would she unleash now that the man she'd loved had chosen his mistress over his own newborn child? The champagne glass slipped from Daniel Ross's hand, but he caught it just before it shattered against the Italian marble floor, his reflexes sharp from years of corporate training at Meridian Global Industries headquarters. 6 months ago, he'd stood in this same ballroom, celebrating his promotion to Senior Vice President of Operations, surrounded by 3 generations of Ross family members who'd built their modest fortune through decades of loyal service to the Thornton Empire. But tonight the crystal chandeliers cast shadows that seemed to judge him for decisions he couldn't take back. "You're distracted," Victoria Lang whispered, her red lips brushing his ear as her fingers traced the expensive fabric of his Tom Ford suit. But Daniel's attention remained fixed on the snow falling outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, each flake a reminder of that night 3 months ago when everything had changed. The night he'd ordered Rebecca removed from his life forever. Daniel's phone buzzed with another email from his father, Richard Ross, the director of international logistics who'd given 38 years to Meridian Global Industries. But the message contained only 3 words that made Daniel's blood run cold. "Meeting tomorrow, Thornton." Edmund Thornton never requested meetings with mid-level executives, even senior ones. But the reclusive billionaire had specifically asked for Daniel by name, and nobody in the Ross family could understand why the owner of an $80 billion empire would want to speak with someone who'd only been with the company for 8 years. "Danny, are you even listening?" Victoria's voice pulled him back to the present, her irritation barely masked by her practiced smile. But Daniel had learned over the past 6 months that his mistress's moods shifted like winter weather, beautiful one moment, brutal the next. "I'm listening," Daniel lied, downing the rest of his champagne as memories of Rebecca flooded his mind, uninvited, unwanted, but impossible to suppress. He'd met her 4 years ago at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle, far from the gleaming Meridian Global Industries tower where his family had built their legacy. But Rebecca had been reading a worn paperback novel in the corner booth, her simple sundress and lack of jewelry suggesting she was as far from his world as possible. She hadn't recognized his name when he'd introduced himself, hadn't cared about his position or his family's reputation, but she'd looked at him with genuine interest when he'd talked about his dreams of designing sustainable urban infrastructure, dreams he'd abandoned years ago to climb the corporate ladder his family expected him to scale. She was nothing, Victoria said, reading his expression with the calculated precision she used in her own role as marketing director at Thornton Media Group, a subsidiary of Meridian Global Industries, but her dismissive tone only intensified the guilt that had been eating at Daniel since that December night. The night Rebecca had given birth to their daughter in the private wing of St. Catherine's Hospital, but Daniel had refused to visit because Victoria had convinced him the pregnancy was a trap, a scheme to tie him to a woman who would drain his resources and damage his reputation. His mother, Patricia Ross, who'd worked as executive assistant to 5 different Meridian Global Industries CEOs over her 32-year career, had supported Victoria's assessment. But Patricia had always been more concerned with social standing than emotional truth. "Mr. Ross, your car is ready," the valet interrupted, but Daniel waved him away, suddenly unable to face the drive back to the penthouse he now shared with Victoria in the building his family could barely afford, despite their collective 6-figure salaries from Meridian Global Industries. The memory of Rebecca's face haunted him, not angry, not bitter, but heartbroken in a way that suggested betrayal far deeper than infidelity. But Daniel had been too consumed by his own ambitions and Victoria's manipulations to recognize the pain he was causing. His phone buzzed again with a message from his younger brother James Ross, who worked in Meridian Global Industries' Technology Innovation Division. "Something's happening. Rumors about Thornton having a daughter. Major restructuring coming. Dad's freaking out." Daniel's heart stopped, but he forced himself to remain calm as Victoria's hand slid into his, her diamond bracelet, a gift he'd bought with money he'd saved for his daughter's future, catching the chandelier light. "Let's go home," Victoria purred, but the word home felt wrong because the penthouse had never felt like home the way the small apartment had when Rebecca used to wait up for him with terrible homemade dinners and genuine conversation about everything except work. The drive through Seattle's snowy streets should have taken 20 minutes, but traffic slowed to a crawl as they approached the financial district, and Daniel noticed unusual activity around Meridian Global Industries headquarters. Black SUVs with tinted windows, security personnel he'd never seen before. But most disturbing was the massive digital billboard across from the building that had been blank for months, suddenly illuminating with a message that made his blood freeze. Meridian Global Industries announces new executive leadership structure. Press conference 9 a.m. "That's impossible," Daniel muttered, because Edmund Thornton never made public announcements, never courted media attention. But the billboard suggested something massive was about to shift in the corporate landscape that employed his entire family. Victoria's phone rang with a call from her supervisor at Thornton Media Group, but her confident expression crumbled as she listened, her face going pale in a way Daniel had never witnessed before. "They're terminating my division," Victoria whispered, after hanging up, her voice stripped of its usual confidence. But Daniel's mind was racing through implications far beyond Victoria's job loss. His phone exploded with calls from family members, his father, his mother, his 2 brothers, his sister, his uncle who managed Meridian Global Industries' West Coast operations, his aunt who'd recently been promoted to Regional Human Resources Director. But Daniel couldn't answer because dread was forming in his stomach like ice. The penthouse felt suffocating when they finally arrived, but Victoria immediately poured herself a glass of wine and began scrolling through social media, her anxiety manifesting as frantic finger movements across her phone screen. "Oh my God," Victoria breathed, her wine glass trembling, but Daniel crossed the room to look at her screen and felt reality, tilt sideways. The headline read, "Edmund Thornton's secret daughter revealed, Rebecca Thornton Mitchell, named new CEO of Meridian Global Industries Humanitarian Division." The accompanying photo showed Rebecca, his Rebecca, but transformed in ways that seemed impossible, standing beside Edmund Thornton in front of Meridian Global Industries headquarters, wearing a tailored black suit that probably cost more than Daniel's car, but her eyes held the same gentle intelligence he'd fallen in love with 4 years ago. "That's not possible," Daniel whispered, but his hands shook as he clicked through article after article, each one revealing details that rewrote his entire understanding of the past 4 years. Rebecca Thornton had been raised in obscurity by her mother, Catherine Mitchell, after Edmund Thornton's first wife had died in childbirth 28 years ago. But Edmund had kept his daughter's existence secret to protect her from the pressures and dangers of extreme wealth. Rebecca had been educated at elite boarding schools under her mother's surname, but she'd deliberately chosen to live a normal life, working as a social worker in Seattle while completing her master's degree in nonprofit management. But she'd maintained contact with her father through monthly visits to his private estate in the San Juan Islands. "She was testing you," Victoria said, her voice bitter with understanding. But Daniel's mind was back in that coffee shop 4 years ago, remembering how Rebecca had asked him questions about his values, his priorities, but he'd been too arrogant to realize he was being evaluated. Another article revealed that Rebecca had informed her father about her relationship with Daniel Ross within weeks of their first date, but Edmund Thornton had instructed his daughter to continue the relationship without revealing her identity, curious to see if this young executive from a family of loyal Meridian Global Industries employees would value character over status. "You failed her test," Victoria said, pouring another glass of wine, but Daniel could hear the fear beneath her cruelty, because if Rebecca had been testing him, Victoria had also been exposed as someone who'd pursued a married man for career advancement. The articles continued with devastating detail. Rebecca had fallen genuinely in love with Daniel despite his increasing obsession with corporate advancement, but she'd hoped their relationship would help him reconnect with the idealistic young man who'd once dreamed of building sustainable cities rather than climbing corporate ladders. The pregnancy had been unplanned but welcomed by Rebecca as an opportunity for Daniel to choose family over ambition, but instead he'd chosen Victoria and the promise of faster promotion through her connections at Thornton Media Group. "The baby," Daniel whispered, his chest constricting as he clicked on another article showing Rebecca holding an infant wrapped in designer blankets, surrounded by security personnel and medical staff, but the caption revealed his daughter's name, Eleanor Catherine Thornton, not Eleanor Ross. Thornton. His daughter had been legally given her mother's real surname, but that meant Daniel had no parental rights, no claim to the child he'd rejected. But worse was the realization that he'd thrown Rebecca and Eleanor out into the snow while his mistress laughed, and everyone in his family's professional circle would soon know that he'd done this to Edmund Thornton's daughter. Victoria's phone rang again, but this time she answered immediately, her desperation obvious. "Yes, I understand. No, I didn't know. Please, there must be—" The call ended abruptly, but Victoria's face revealed that her career at Thornton Media Group was over. "She's destroying us," Victoria said, but her accusation rang hollow because Rebecca hadn't needed to destroy anyone. Daniel and Victoria had destroyed themselves through their own choices. Daniel's phone finally stopped buzzing with family calls and instead received a single text message from an unknown number. 9 a.m. meeting, Edmund Thornton's office. Come alone. Rebecca. The night passed in sleepless anxiety, but Daniel couldn't stop researching everything he could find about Rebecca's true identity. Each new detail, a knife to his conscience. Edmund Thornton had built Meridian Global Industry from a small import-export business into an $80 billion empire spanning technology, media, manufacturing, logistics, and humanitarian initiatives across 47 countries. But unlike most billionaires, Thornton had maintained a reputation for treating employees with unusual fairness. The Ross family's comfortable lifestyle was possible because Meridian Global Industries paid above industry standards and provided exceptional benefits. But the articles also revealed Edmund Thornton's legendary protectiveness regarding his late wife and secret daughter, with several stories about business rivals who'd attempted to investigate Rebecca's existence and found themselves facing devastating legal and financial consequences. But Daniel had done worse than investigate. He'd married Edmund Thornton's daughter, impregnated her, then thrown her and his granddaughter out into a snowstorm while his mistress laughed. Victoria left the penthouse at dawn without explanation, but Daniel suspected she was trying to salvage something from the wreckage of her career, though he couldn't imagine what that might be. The Meridian Global Industries headquarters building pierced the Seattle skyline like a steel and glass monument to power, but Daniel had never felt smaller than when he entered the private elevator that led to Edmund Thornton's executive floor, an area he'd never been permitted to access despite his senior vice president title. The elevator opened into a reception area decorated with museum-quality art and furniture that cost more than his parents' house, but the elderly receptionist smiled warmly and said, "Mr. Ross, Ms. Thornton is expecting you in the conference room." Ms. Thornton, not Mrs. Ross. The conference room overlooked Puget Sound with views that made Daniel's expensive penthouse seem like a college dormitory, but his attention fixed on Rebecca sitting at the head of a table that could accommodate 30 people, her posture perfect and professional, but her eyes still carried that same gentle quality he'd fallen in love with, now mixed with something harder that he'd earned through his cruelty. "Hello, Daniel," Rebecca said, her voice steady and calm, but Daniel noticed how her hands rested protectively on a leather portfolio embossed with the Meridian Global Industries logo. "Rebecca, Daniel started, but she raised one hand to stop him. "You'll have time to speak," Rebecca said. But then a door opened and Edmund Thornton entered, and Daniel understood why his entire family had spent decades being terrified and grateful in equal measure. Edmund Thornton was 73 years old, but moved with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his right to command any space he entered, his silver hair and tailored suit suggesting power that didn't need to announce itself. But his eyes, the same warm brown as Rebecca's, held an intelligence that saw through every pretense Daniel might attempt. "Mr. Ross," Edmund said, sitting beside his daughter but not offering a handshake, "I've been wanting to meet you for quite some time." Daniel's mouth went dry, but he managed to respond, "Sir, I didn't know." "That my daughter was testing your character?" Edmund interrupted, his tone conversational but his words cutting. "Yes, I'm aware. Rebecca chose to experience life without the complications of wealth because I raised her to understand that money reveals people's true nature. You revealed yours quite spectacularly." The word spectacularly hung in the air like poison, but Daniel couldn't defend himself because every accusation was deserved. "My daughter loved you," Edmund continued, opening the portfolio to reveal documents Daniel couldn't read from his position. "But you chose career advancement and a woman who saw you as a stepping stone over the person who valued you for reasons that had nothing to do with utility." Rebecca remained silent, but Daniel could see the pain beneath her professional mask, and guilt crashed through him with physical force. "Your family has served Meridian Global Industries with distinction for 3 generations, Edmund said, his tone shifting to something colder. "But your father, Richard Ross, is Director of International Logistics. Your mother, Patricia Ross, has been executive assistant to multiple CEOs. Your brother, James, works in technology, innovation, Your sister Michelle manages regional sales, and your Uncle Thomas oversees West Coast operations. Your family's collective employment represents approximately 43 positions across Meridian Global Industries, when you include cousins, spouses who've joined the company, and extended family members. The number hit Daniel like a punch because he'd never calculated how thoroughly his family's lives were intertwined with Meridian Global Industries. But Edmund Thornton clearly had. 43 positions representing approximately $8.7 million in annual salaries, benefits, and pension contributions, Edmund continued. But his tone suggested he was reading from a grocery list rather than discussing millions of dollars and multiple family livelihoods. Please, Daniel heard himself say, his pride evaporating. Whatever you're going to do, don't punish my family for my mistakes. Edmund's expression didn't change, but Rebecca flinched slightly, and Daniel realized his plea had hurt her more than his betrayal because it revealed he still cared more about his family's security than the woman and child he'd abandoned. Your family's positions are secure, Rebecca said quietly, speaking for the first time since her father entered, because unlike you, I don't believe in destroying people's lives to satisfy my anger. The relief Daniel felt lasted only seconds before Rebecca continued. But you personally are being reassigned effective immediately. She slid a document across the table, but Daniel's hands shook as he read the transfer order. Daniel Ross, Senior Vice President of Operations, reassigned to Director of Humanitarian Logistics, Meridian Global Industries, East Africa Division based in Nairobi, Kenya, effective April 1st. That's in 3 weeks, Daniel whispered, but the implications were devastating. He was being sent to the other side of the world, to one of the company's smallest divisions. A massive demotion disguised as a transfer, but more importantly, he would be separated from his daughter by thousands of miles. You'll be managing supply chain logistics for our humanitarian projects across Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda, Rebecca explained, her tone purely professional. But the work is meaningful, distributing medical supplies, educational materials, and food assistance to communities that desperately need them. It's the kind of work you once told me you wanted to do before you decided corporate advancement mattered more than making a difference. Daniel's throat constricted because she was throwing his own abandoned dreams back at him, but she wasn't wrong. 4 years ago, he'd talked passionately about wanting to use his logistics expertise to help people rather than just optimize profit margins. The position pays $127,000 annually, which is approximately 40% less than your current salary. Edmund added, but housing and transportation are provided, and the cost of living in Nairobi is significantly lower than Seattle. What about Victoria? Daniel asked before he could stop himself, but Rebecca's expression hardened. Ms. Lang's employment with Thornton Media Group has been terminated, Rebecca said, each word precise and cold. But not because of her relationship with you. Her performance reviews over the past 18 months revealed consistent misrepresentation of project outcomes, misappropriation of marketing budgets, and workplace harassment complaints from 3 different subordinates. The investigation began 6 months ago, but the timing of her termination is purely coincidental. The explanation was too perfect, too convenient, but Daniel suspected every word was true because Rebecca had never been a liar. He'd been the one who'd built their relationship on false pretenses by pretending to be someone he wasn't. I deserve worse, Daniel admitted, his voice breaking. But I want you to know that I loved you. I still... Don't, Rebecca interrupted, her professional mask cracking slightly. Because you didn't love me enough to choose our daughter over your ambitions. You didn't love me enough to question Victoria's motivations. You didn't love me enough to see me shivering in the snow with our newborn and feel anything except relief. that we were gone. The words eviscerated him, but Daniel couldn't argue because he'd stood in the doorway of his family's mansion, the mansion they'd bought with decades of Meridian Global Industries salaries, and watched security drag Rebecca away while Victoria laughed, and he'd felt nothing except irritation that the situation hadn't been resolved more quickly. "Eleanor is 6 months old now," Rebecca said, opening her phone to show Daniel photos of his daughter, a beautiful baby with dark curls and brown eyes, surrounded by toys and care that Daniel couldn't have provided, even with his senior vice president's salary. "But she'll never know you rejected her because I'll make sure she grows up understanding that her father made a terrible mistake, but wasn't a terrible person." The generosity of that statement broke something in Daniel because he didn't deserve Rebecca's grace, but she was offering it anyway for their daughter's sake. "Can I see her?" Daniel asked, hope rising despite the impossibility of the situation. "Before I leave for Kenya?" Rebecca and Edmund exchanged glances, but Edmund nodded slightly, giving his daughter permission to make the decision. "Once," Rebecca said finally, "but supervised, and only because I believe Eleanor deserves to have some memory of you, even if that memory is just photographs from one afternoon." Daniel nodded, tears streaming down his face, but he managed to say, "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Rebecca replied, standing, to indicate the meeting was over, "because this isn't kindness. It's me being a better person than you were to us." The elevator ride back down felt like descending into hell, but Daniel's phone immediately buzzed with messages from family members who'd somehow learned about his reassignment. His father demanding explanations, his mother crying about the scandal, his siblings confused about what had happened. But Daniel couldn't respond because he was trying to process the magnitude of his losses. The penthouse was empty when he returned, but Victoria had removed all her belongings, leaving only a note on the kitchen counter. "You were supposed to protect me. Instead, you destroyed us both. Don't contact me again." The accusation was absurd because Daniel hadn't destroyed Victoria. She'd destroyed herself through her own misconduct, but he'd enabled her behavior by choosing her validation over Rebecca's genuine love. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of logistics, selling the penthouse, storing furniture, closing bank accounts. But the hardest part was facing his family's disappointment and confusion, because they couldn't understand why Edmund Thornton had taken such personal interest in punishing Daniel specifically. "What did you do?" his father demanded during an emergency family dinner at the mansion. But Daniel couldn't explain without revealing that he'd married, impregnated, and abandoned Edmund Thornton's secret daughter. "I made mistakes," Daniel said vaguely, but his mother Patricia's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "This has something to do with that girl, doesn't it?" Patricia said, her tone dripping with disdain. "The one you were married to before Victoria." "Her name is Rebecca," Daniel said quietly, but his mother waved dismissively. "Whatever her name was, she trapped you with a pregnancy and tried to ruin your career," Patricia continued. But Daniel felt anger rise in his chest for the first time since the meeting with Edmund Thornton. "No," Daniel interrupted, his voice harder than he'd ever used with his mother. "Rebecca loved me despite my flaws, but I chose career advancement over her and our daughter. Everything that's happening is my fault, not hers." The confession silenced the dining room, but his younger brother James looked at him with new understanding. "The rumors about Thornton's daughter," James said slowly, connecting pieces Daniel hadn't shared. "They said she married someone who worked at Meridian Global Industries but kept her identity secret. That was you, wasn't it?" Daniel's silence confirmed the suspicion, but his father's face turned red with fury. "You married Edmund Thornton's daughter and didn't tell us," Richard Ross shouted, standing so abruptly his chair crashed backward. "Do you have any idea what connections we could have?" That's exactly why she didn't tell anyone, Daniel interrupted, understanding Rebecca's decision with new clarity because she wanted to be loved for herself, not for her father's wealth and power. His mother's expression shifted from confusion to calculation as she processed the implications. If you're still married to her, the baby is Edmund Thornton's legitimate grandchild, which means, I have no parental rights, Daniel said flatly, cutting off his mother's scheming before it could fully form. Rebecca used her legal surname when Eleanor was born, and I signed away my rights when I threw them out. There's no connection to leverage, no advantage to gain. I lost everything that mattered because I was too blind and arrogant to recognize what I had. The admission hung in the air, but his family's disappointed expressions revealed they cared more about the lost opportunity than Daniel's emotional devastation. Only his brother James approached him after dinner, gripping his shoulder with unexpected empathy. I'm sorry, man. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing by accepting the Kenya position. Maybe distance will give you perspective. The kindness almost broke Daniel again, but he managed to nod his gratitude. The supervised visit with Eleanor happened on Daniel's last day in Seattle, at a neutral location Rebecca's lawyers had selected. A private room in a children's museum with security personnel stationed outside and a social worker documenting every moment. Rebecca arrived with Eleanor in a stroller that probably cost more than Daniel's first car, but her expression remained guarded as she lifted their daughter and carried her toward where Daniel stood frozen by the weight of his mistakes. Say hello to your father, Rebecca whispered to Eleanor, who gurgled happily and reached toward Daniel with chubby hands. Holding his daughter for the first time shattered whatever remained of Daniel's composure, but Eleanor seemed completely comfortable with him, her tiny fingers gripping his thumb while she stared at his face with curious brown eyes that mirrored Rebecca's. She's perfect, Daniel managed to say, tears streaming freely, but Rebecca's expression remained neutral. She is, Rebecca agreed, and she'll grow up knowing her worth isn't determined by anyone else's validation or rejection. The message was clear. Eleanor would never experience the conditional love and manipulation that had characterized Daniel's family dynamics, but Rebecca would ensure their daughter understood her value regardless of her father's failures. The hour passed too quickly, but Daniel took hundreds of photos and tried to memorize every detail of his daughter's face, knowing it might be years before he saw her again. I'll send monthly updates, Rebecca said as she prepared to leave, her tone softening slightly. Photos and videos so you can watch her grow. But don't mistake this generosity for forgiveness. I'm doing this for Eleanor, not for you. I understand, Daniel replied, reluctantly returning his daughter to Rebecca's arms, and I'm grateful for anything you're willing to share. Rebecca paused at the door, her expression conflicted. You were a good man once, Daniel. The person who talked about building sustainable cities and making a difference in the world. That person could have been an amazing father and partner. I hope you find him again in Kenya. Then she was gone, taking Eleanor and the life Daniel had destroyed through his own choices. The flight to Nairobi lasted 23 hours with connections through London and Amsterdam, but Daniel spent most of the journey reading everything he could find about Meridian Global Industries' humanitarian division, the work Rebecca had assigned him to manage. The division focused on supply chain logistics for medical supplies, educational materials, clean water infrastructure, and food distribution across East Africa, partnering with local NGOs and government agencies to reach communities that commercial systems ignored, but the budget was relatively small compared to Meridian Global Industries' other operations, only $47 million annually. Yet as Daniel read case studies about villages receiving their first medical clinics, or schools getting supplies that enabled children to continue their education, he realized Rebecca hadn't just demoted him. She'd given him an opportunity to become the person he'd once claimed he wanted to be. The Nairobi office occupied a modest building near the city center, far from the gleaming Meridian Global Industries towers in Seattle, London, or Tokyo. But the local staff greeted Daniel with warmth that surprised him, because he'd expected resentment toward an American executive being parachuted into their operation. "Welcome, Mr. Ross," said Agnes Kamani, the operations manager who'd been running the East Africa division for 12 years. "Ms. Thornton called to explain you'd be joining us. We're excited to have someone with your logistics expertise helping expand our reach." The mention of Rebecca sent a pang through Daniel's chest, but he forced himself to focus on the work. The first month in Kenya shattered Daniel's assumptions about humanitarian work. Nothing was simple. Everything took longer than expected, but the impact was undeniable when he accompanied Agnes on a field visit to a rural Kenyan village, receiving their first shipment of medical supplies through Meridian Global Industries distribution network. "Before your company partnered with us," explained Dr. Sarah Mwangi, who ran a small clinic serving 5 villages, "we had to travel 3 hours to get basic antibiotics. Now we can treat infections before they become life-threatening." The gratitude in Dr. Mwangi's voice was more genuine than any praise Daniel had received for optimizing corporate profit margins. But he was beginning to understand what Rebecca had tried to show him. Success measured in human well-being felt different than success measured in stock prices and quarterly earnings. His evenings in Nairobi were spent in a modest apartment, reviewing supply chain proposals, but he also began video calling his brother James, who'd become an unexpected ally since Daniel's reassignment. "The family's been talking," James said during one of their weekly calls. "Dad's still angry, Mom's still scheming about ways to reconnect you with Rebecca, but I think you're actually doing something important over there." "It's the hardest work I've ever done," Daniel admitted, "but it's also the first time I've felt like my job actually matters beyond making rich people richer." James nodded thoughtfully. "Rebecca knew exactly what she was doing when she sent you there, didn't she?" "She gave me a chance to become someone worthy of our daughter's respect," Daniel said, looking at the framed photo of Eleanor he kept on his desk. "But I don't know if one redemption arc in Africa can make up for abandoning them in the snow." The photo was from the supervised visit, Eleanor smiling at something off camera, her expression pure joy, but Daniel wondered if his daughter would ever smile at him that way again. Rebecca kept her promise about monthly updates, but the emails were brief and factual. Eleanor's developmental milestones, photos of her learning to crawl, then walk, videos of her saying her first words, but no personal messages about Rebecca's own life or feelings. Daniel responded to each email with gratitude and updates about his work in Kenya, hoping to demonstrate through actions rather than words that he was changing, but he never asked for more than Rebecca was willing to give. 6 months into his Kenya assignment, Daniel received an unexpected email from Edmund Thornton himself. "Your performance reviews from Agnes Kamani are exceptional. You've increased distribution efficiency by 34%, while reducing costs by 18%, enabling us to expand services to 3 additional regions. Well done, E.T." The praise should have felt good, but Daniel's response was complicated because he was succeeding in ways that might have impressed Rebecca 4 years ago, but he'd needed to lose everything before he'd been willing to pursue meaningful work over corporate advancement. A year into his assignment, Daniel was reviewing proposals for expanding Meridian Global Industries' humanitarian operations into South Sudan when Agnes knocked on his office door with unusual urgency. "We have a situation," Agnes said, her expression grave. "There's a refugee crisis developing near the Uganda border, but we don't have approval to redirect emergency medical supplies outside our established distribution network. Daniel immediately began calculating logistics. They could mobilize supplies within 12 hours if they used existing inventory designated for routine distributions, but deviating from approved plans could result in his termination, especially given his probationary status. "How many people need help?" Daniel asked, but Agnes's expression told him the answer would be devastating. "Conservative estimates suggest 15,000 refugees fleeing conflict, but the nearest UN relief station is 3 days away," Agnes explained, pulling up maps on her tablet. "We could provide emergency medical supplies and water purification equipment that might save hundreds of lives, but we'd need executive approval to release the resources." Daniel stared at the maps, seeing the same choice that had defined his life: follow the rules and protect his career, or break protocol to help people who desperately needed assistance. But this time, the choice was obvious. "Contact our warehouse and begin loading supplies," Daniel said, already composing an email to Edmund Thornton explaining his decision. "I'll take full responsibility if Meridian Global Industries disapproves, but we're not going to let people die because I'm afraid of being fired." Agnes smiled with approval. "Ms. Thornton said you used to care about making a difference. I think she'd be proud of this decision." The emergency response saved an estimated 400 lives, according to preliminary reports from relief organizations, but Daniel's unauthorized resource deployment put him in direct violation of company policy, and he waited 3 anxious days for Edmund Thornton's response. When the email finally arrived, it contained a single sentence: "Initiative approved retroactively, increasing your operating budget by $12 million to handle similar situations. Your probation is ended effective immediately. E.T." Daniel read the message 3 times, but the implication was clear. He'd been tested again, and this time he'd made the right choice. That night, he received an unexpected video call from Rebecca, the first personal communication in over a year, but her expression was complicated when her face appeared on his screen. "I heard about the refugee crisis," Rebecca said without preamble, "and I wanted you to know that was exactly the kind of decision I always hoped you'd make." Daniel's throat tightened, but he managed to respond, "I'm trying to become someone Eleanor could be proud of, even if she never knows me." Rebecca's expression softened slightly. "She will know you, Daniel. I've been keeping a journal for her about your work in Kenya, the villages you've helped, the lives you've saved. When she's old enough to understand, she'll know that her father learned from his mistakes and became someone who made the world better." The generosity of that gift overwhelmed Daniel, but before he could respond, Rebecca turned her camera to show Eleanor, now 18 months old, playing with building blocks on an expensive rug in what appeared to be a nursery designed by professional decorators. "Eleanor, look who's on the screen," Rebecca said gently, pointing at the camera. "It's Daddy." Eleanor looked up, her expression curious, but then she smiled with recognition that suggested she'd been shown Daniel's photos regularly, and she waved a chubby hand at the camera. "Dada!" The moment broke Daniel completely, but Rebecca's expression showed she understood. His tears were grief and gratitude mixed together. "I'm going to let you say goodnight to her," Rebecca said. "But Daniel, I need you to know that I'm seeing someone." The announcement hit harder than Daniel expected, but he forced himself to nod calmly. "His name is Marcus Williams. He's a pediatric surgeon at Seattle Children's Hospital," Rebecca continued, her tone gentle but firm. "We met through one of my father's charitable foundations. He's kind to Eleanor, and he makes me happy in ways I'd forgotten were possible." Daniel swallowed hard, but managed to say, "I'm glad you're happy. You deserve someone who recognizes your worth without needing to lose you first." Rebecca's eyes glistened slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Thank you for saying that. I wasn't sure how you'd react. I lost the right to object when I threw you out into the snow, Daniel replied, but I hope Marcus understands how lucky he is. They spent 10 minutes with Eleanor, Daniel making funny faces that made his daughter giggle with delight. But when the call ended, Daniel sat alone in his Nairobi apartment crying for the family he'd destroyed, and the life he'd never be able to reclaim. The next 2 years passed with Daniel throwing himself into humanitarian logistics work with an intensity that earned him recognition across Meridian Global Industries' charitable operations. But his personal life remained empty, except for monthly video calls with Eleanor and occasional updates from Rebecca about his daughter's development. Eleanor's third birthday party happened without him, but Rebecca sent photos of the celebration at Edmund Thornton's private estate, a garden party with dozens of children, entertainers, and the kind of lavish decorations that money could buy. But Eleanor's smile in every photo suggested she was genuinely happy. Marcus Williams appeared in several photos smiling comfortably beside Rebecca, while Eleanor hugged his leg, and Daniel had to accept that his daughter was developing a relationship with the man who'd stepped into the father role Daniel had abandoned. She calls him Uncle Marcus, Rebecca explained during their monthly call, but she knows you're her father. We look at pictures of you every night before bed, and she knows Daddy works in Africa helping people. The explanation should have provided comfort, but Daniel couldn't shake the fear that Eleanor would eventually forget him entirely, replaced by Marcus in every meaningful way. His work in East Africa expanded significantly when Edmund Thornton approved a $67 million initiative to develop sustainable water infrastructure across rural Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, putting Daniel in charge of the largest humanitarian project in Meridian Global Industries history. But success in his professional life only highlighted emptiness in his personal world. You should date, Agnes suggested, during a team dinner celebrating their water infrastructure project's first phase completion. You're a good man doing important work, but you can't punish yourself forever for past mistakes. I'm not punishing myself, Daniel protested, but Agnes's skeptical expression suggested she didn't believe him. You're alone in a foreign country, working 70-hour weeks, and your only personal relationships are video calls with a daughter who's being raised by another man. Agnes said bluntly, that's either dedication or penance, but I suspect it's mostly the latter. The observation stung because it was accurate, but Daniel couldn't imagine being with anyone except Rebecca, and she'd moved on with someone who deserved her in ways Daniel never had. 3.5 years into his Kenya assignment, Daniel received an unexpected message from Edmund Thornton requesting a video conference, and his first thought was that something had happened to Rebecca or Eleanor. Mr. Ross, Edmund said when his face appeared on screen, his expression unreadable. I'm calling to discuss your future with Meridian Global Industries. Daniel's stomach dropped, but he waited silently for Edmund to continue. Your work in East Africa has exceeded every expectation, Edmund continued. You've transformed our humanitarian division from a modest charitable operation into a model for corporate social responsibility that other organizations are studying and attempting to replicate. But I'm concerned you're hiding in Kenya rather than truly building a life. The accusation was uncomfortably accurate, but Daniel wasn't sure how to respond. Rebecca asked me to check on you, Edmund admitted, his tone softening slightly. She's worried that you're using work to avoid processing your guilt and grief. She thinks you need to come home. Home to Seattle? Daniel asked, hope and fear colliding in his chest. Home to confront what you've been running from, Edmund clarified, your family, your daughter, and the man who's preparing to propose to Rebecca. The final detail felt like a knife to Daniel's heart, but Edmund's expression remained neutral. Marcus Williams has asked for my permission to marry my daughter, Edmund explained. And while I appreciate the traditional gesture, the decision is ultimately Rebecca's. But she won't make that decision while you're still emotionally trapped in the past. What does she want from me? Daniel asked, confusion and pain mixing together. Closure, Edmund said simply, for both of you. She needs to know that you've genuinely changed and that you support her happiness, even if that happiness doesn't include you. And you need to see your daughter as more than a photograph and understand what you actually lost. The proposition was emotionally devastating, but Daniel recognized the wisdom in Edmund's assessment. When should I come? Daniel asked quietly. Next month, Edmund replied. Rebecca's birthday. She's turning 32, and she wants Eleanor to have both her parents at the celebration, even if they're not together. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel. Rebecca's birthday was exactly 4 years after the night he'd thrown her out into the snow, but she was offering him an invitation to witness her happiness rather than excluding him in revenge. I'll be there, Daniel promised, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to do the right thing, even if it's 4 years too late. Edmund's expression shifted to something almost paternal. You're not the same man Rebecca married, Daniel. The question is whether you've become someone worthy of her respect, if not her love. The flight from Nairobi to Seattle felt longer than the original journey 4 years earlier, but Daniel spent the travel time mentally preparing to face everything he'd been avoiding: his family, his failures, and the reality that Rebecca had built a beautiful life without him. His brother James met him at the airport, their relationship having strengthened over 4 years of weekly video calls, but James's expression was sympathetic as they drove toward downtown Seattle. Fair warning, James said, the family's going to be weird. Mom's been fantasizing about you and Rebecca getting back together ever since she learned who Rebecca really is, but Dad's still angry that you wasted the connection, and Michelle and the others are just confused about the whole situation. How's your job? Daniel asked, deliberately changing the subject, but James smiled. Actually got promoted to Director of Technology Innovation last year, James said proudly. But I learned from watching your mistakes. I'm focusing on meaningful work rather than just climbing the ladder. The pride Daniel felt for his brother was genuine, but it was mixed with regret that he hadn't provided a better example earlier. The hotel where Daniel was staying was modest compared to the penthouse he'd once shared with Victoria, but the simplicity felt appropriate for who he'd become over the past 4 years. Rebecca's birthday celebration was scheduled for the following evening at Edmund Thornton's private estate in the San Juan Islands, requiring a seaplane flight that would give Daniel time to prepare mentally, but nothing could truly prepare him for seeing Rebecca and Eleanor in person after so much time. The Thornton estate was stunning, a modern architectural masterpiece built into a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, with glass walls that seemed to blur the boundaries between interior comfort and natural beauty, but Daniel's attention fixed on the family gathering visible through those walls. Rebecca stood on a terrace wearing a simple blue dress that highlighted her natural beauty, but she was laughing at something Marcus Williams had said, her hand resting comfortably on his arm in a way that suggested genuine affection and trust. Marcus was everything Daniel wasn't: tall where Daniel was average height, confident in a relaxed way rather than Daniel's anxious ambition. But most importantly, Marcus looked at Rebecca with unguarded adoration that suggested he couldn't believe his luck in finding her. Eleanor ran across the terrace chasing a golden retriever puppy, her dark curls bouncing as she shrieked with 4-year-old delight. But she was so much bigger than the toddler Daniel remembered from video calls that he almost didn't recognize his own daughter. "You can go in," Edmund said from behind Daniel, his presence unexpected but not unwelcome. "Rebecca's been waiting for you." Daniel took a deep breath and walked through the glass doors. but Eleanor spotted him first and froze mid-run, her expression curious but uncertain. "Daddy," Eleanor said tentatively, the word clearly familiar from photographs and stories, but strange when applied to the actual man standing in front of her. "Hi, sweetheart," Daniel said, kneeling to Eleanor's level, his voice breaking slightly. "It's so good to finally see you in person." Eleanor approached cautiously, but then she launched herself into Daniel's arms with the trust of a child who'd been taught her father was someone safe and loving, even if he'd been physically absent. The hug broke Daniel completely, but he held his daughter tightly while tears streamed down his face, finally understanding the magnitude of what he'd thrown away 4 years ago. "You're crying," Eleanor observed with 4-year-old directness, touching Daniel's face with gentle fingers. "Are you sad?" "No, baby," Daniel managed to say. "I'm happy because I get to hold you." Rebecca had approached silently, but her own eyes were glistening as she watched father and daughter together for the first time in years. "She's been excited all week," Rebecca said softly. "I showed her pictures and told her you'd be here, but I think seeing you in person is different." "Thank you," Daniel said, looking up at Rebecca while still holding Eleanor, "for giving me this. I don't deserve your generosity." "You're her father," Rebecca replied simply, "and regardless of our history, Eleanor deserves to know you." Marcus Williams approached with the comfortable confidence of someone who had nothing to prove, but his handshake was firm and his expression friendly when he introduced himself. "Daniel, good to finally meet you," Marcus said. "Rebecca's told me a lot about your work in Kenya. Sounds like you're doing incredible things over there." The kindness in Marcus's tone was genuine, but Daniel recognized it for what it was. The graciousness of a man who'd already won and could afford to be magnanimous toward the one who'd lost. "Thank you," Daniel replied, "and congratulations on everything." The vague statement encompassed Marcus's relationship with Rebecca, his clear bond with Eleanor, and the proposal everyone knew was coming, but Marcus had the grace to simply nod in acknowledgement. The birthday celebration progressed with Daniel existing on the periphery, grateful to be included, but painfully aware he was a guest at a party celebrating a life he wasn't part of anymore. Edmund Thornton gave a toast praising his daughter's intelligence, compassion, and strength, but he also acknowledged Daniel's presence. 4 years ago, Rebecca made difficult choices that revealed her character and forced others to confront theirs. Tonight, we celebrate not just her birthday, but her wisdom in building a life surrounded by people who recognize her worth. The toast was diplomatic, but the message was clear. Daniel had failed the test, but Rebecca had moved forward and found people who appreciated her properly. Later in the evening, Rebecca pulled Daniel aside to a quiet corner of the terrace where they could talk privately while still keeping Eleanor in sight. "I need to tell you something," Rebecca said, her expression serious. "Marcus is going to propose next month. I wanted you to hear it from me first." Daniel had known this moment was coming, but hearing the confirmation still felt like losing Rebecca all over again. "Are you going to say yes?" Daniel asked, though he already knew the answer. "I am," Rebecca confirmed, "because Marcus is everything I need him to be, present, honest, and willing to put Eleanor and me first without needing to lose us to learn our value." The comparison to Daniel's failures was implicit, but devastating. "I'm happy for you," Daniel said, meaning it despite the pain. "You deserve someone who appreciates you from the beginning." Rebecca's expression softened. "You've changed, Daniel. The man who left his humanitarian work to come halfway around the world for his daughter's birthday celebration isn't the same person who threw us out 4 years ago. But change doesn't erase history, and I've built a life with someone who was there when I needed him." "I know," Daniel replied, "and I'm not asking for another chance. I just wanted you to know that losing you and Eleanor was the worst mistake of my life, but it taught me what actually matters. The work I'm doing in Kenya, helping communities access medical care and clean water, that's the person I should have been when we were together." "That's exactly who I fell in love with," Rebecca said quietly, "the idealistic guy in the coffee shop who talked about wanting to make a difference. I'm glad you found that person again, even if it took losing everything to rediscover him." They stood in comfortable silence, watching Eleanor play with Marcus and the puppy, but the scene represented a family Daniel could observe but never truly join. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said eventually. "When you were testing me 4 years ago, did you ever think I might pass?" Rebecca considered the question thoughtfully. "I hoped you would. I believed the person I fell in love with was still inside you, buried under ambition and family pressure. But when you chose Victoria and promotion over our daughter's first breath, I realized I'd been wrong about who you'd become." "You weren't wrong," Daniel corrected gently. "That person was still inside me. I just needed to lose everything to find him again." Rebecca smiled sadly. "The tragedy is that if you'd found him 4 years ago, we'd be standing here as a family instead of friendly co-parents." The truth of that statement hung between them, but Eleanor's voice calling, "Daddy, come play," interrupted their conversation, and Daniel was grateful for the excuse to escape his emotional turmoil. He spent the rest of the evening playing with his daughter, building memories he'd treasured during the long months back in Kenya. But the happiness was bittersweet, because he was borrowing time with Eleanor, rather than sharing her daily life. As the celebration wound down and guests began departing via seaplane, Edmund Thornton pulled Daniel aside for a private conversation in his study, a room filled with books, art, and photographs documenting Rebecca's childhood that Daniel had never been allowed to see. "You handled today well," Edmund observed, pouring 2 glasses of bourbon, "but I want to discuss your long-term situation with Eleanor." Daniel accepted the drink but waited nervously for Edmund to continue. "Marcus is a good man and will be an excellent stepfather," Edmund said bluntly, "but you're Eleanor's biological father and she deserves a genuine relationship with you. However, you can't build that relationship from Kenya." The implication was obvious, but Daniel needed clarification. "Are you asking me to move back to Seattle?" "I'm offering you a choice," Edmund corrected. "Continue the excellent work you're doing in East Africa, or accept a promotion to Senior Director of Global Humanitarian Operations based here in Seattle, overseeing all of Meridian Global Industries' charitable initiatives worldwide." The offer was stunning. A massive promotion that would bring Daniel home, but also acknowledge his professional growth. But accepting meant watching Rebecca marry Marcus and Eleanor call another man Dad in everything but name. "Why would you offer me that?" Daniel asked, suspicious of generosity he didn't deserve. "Because Rebecca asked me to," Edmund replied. "She believes Eleanor needs her father in her life regularly, and she trusts that you've changed enough to handle seeing her happy with someone else." The second reason struck harder than the first, because it revealed Rebecca's faith in Daniel's character, despite everything he'd done to betray that faith. "I'll take the position," Daniel said without hesitation, "but I need you to know I'm not doing this to interfere with Rebecca's relationship with Marcus. I'm doing it because being Eleanor's father is more important than protecting myself from painful reminders of my mistakes." Edmund nodded with approval. "That's the right answer. You'll start in 3 months, which gives you time to transition your Kenya responsibilities and relocate." The timeline would bring Daniel back to Seattle shortly after Rebecca's wedding to Marcus, but the positioning felt intentional. Edmund wanted Daniel to accept Rebecca's new marriage as reality before resuming an active role in Eleanor's life. The conversation ended with Edmund showing Daniel photographs of Rebecca's childhood, birthday parties, school plays, vacations with her mother, before Catherine Mitchell passed away when Rebecca was 16. But every image revealed a girl who'd been loved and protected, despite her father's vast wealth and power. She chose to marry you without revealing her identity, because she wanted to know if you'd love her for herself, Edmund explained, pointing to a photo of teenage Rebecca, volunteering at a homeless shelter. But she also wanted to see if you'd choose character over convenience when tested. You failed that test spectacularly, but the fact that you're here now, supporting her happiness, despite your pain, suggests you learned the lesson she was trying to teach. The flight back to Kenya the next morning felt different, because Daniel was returning to finish something, rather than hide from his failures. But the 3 months passed quickly as he trained his replacement and systematically documented 4 years of operational improvements and relationships he'd built across East Africa. Agnes Kamani threw him a farewell party attended by dozens of local partners, NGO representatives, and community leaders whose lives had been improved by Meridian Global Industries' humanitarian work under Daniel's leadership. But the speeches praising his impact felt surreal, because he still thought of himself as someone who'd once thrown his pregnant wife out into the snow. "You came here broken," Agnes said during her toast, "but you let that brokenness make you better instead of bitter. The villages you've helped will remember you for generations." The praise was generous, but Daniel knew the truth. He hadn't come to Kenya to help others. He'd been sent there as punishment and had only gradually discovered that meaningful work could provide redemption he didn't deserve. The return to Seattle coincided with autumn, and Daniel's new office in Meridian Global Industries headquarters occupied the floor directly below Rebecca's humanitarian division, a positioning that seemed designed to force them into regular professional interaction. "Welcome home," Rebecca said during their first official meeting, her tone professional but warm. "I'm looking forward to working with you on expanding our global initiatives." Marcus had proposed during a beach vacation in Hawaii, but Rebecca wore her engagement ring casually, without the self-conscious display that would suggest she was using it to establish territory, and Daniel appreciated her discretion. "Congratulations on your engagement," Daniel said formally. "Have you set a date?" "Next spring," Rebecca replied. "Small ceremony at my father's estate. Eleanor will be flower girl." The mention of Eleanor reminded Daniel that his daughter was the real reason for his return, but Rebecca anticipated his question. "She's excited you're back," Rebecca said, pulling up her calendar. "I've arranged for you to spend every Saturday with her. Supervised initially, but we can adjust based on how things go." The supervised conditions stung slightly, but Daniel understood Rebecca's caution. He'd abandoned Eleanor once, and proving himself trustworthy again would take time. The first Saturday with Eleanor involved a visit to the Seattle Aquarium, and Daniel was nervous as a teenager on a first date. But his daughter's enthusiasm erased his anxiety within minutes. "Daddy, look at the octopus!" Eleanor shrieked, pressing her face against the glass. "It has 8 arms!" The pure joy in Eleanor's voice reminded Daniel of everything he'd missed during her first 4 years. But rather than dwelling on regret, he focused on being fully present for every moment they had together. Rebecca had arranged for a family friend to supervise the visit, but the woman, an older lady named Margaret, who'd apparently known Catherine Mitchell, spent most of the time reading on a bench while Daniel and Eleanor explored the aquarium together. "Your mommy says you like fish," Daniel said, watching Eleanor stare, mesmerized at a school of silvery salmon. "I like all animals," Eleanor corrected seriously, "but fish are special because they can breathe underwater, and Uncle Marcus says that's like having a superpower." The casual mention of Marcus was painful but expected, and Daniel forced himself to respond positively. "Uncle Marcus is right. What's your favorite animal?" "Elephants," Eleanor declared, moving to the next exhibit, because they're big and strong but also gentle, and they remember their families forever even when they're far apart. The choice of favorite animal felt painfully symbolic, but Daniel wondered if Rebecca had deliberately taught Eleanor about elephants' memory and family bonds as a way of explaining her father's absence. The afternoon passed too quickly, but as Daniel returned Eleanor to Rebecca at the agreed meeting spot, his daughter hugged him tightly and whispered, "Can we go to the zoo next time? They have real elephants." "Absolutely," Daniel promised, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. "I'll take you anywhere you want to go." Rebecca watched the interaction with an expression Daniel couldn't quite read, but later she sent him a text message. "She hasn't stopped talking about the aquarium. Thank you for making today special." The acknowledgement felt like a small victory, but Daniel was learning that rebuilding trust happened through accumulated small victories rather than grand gestures. His professional work at Meridian Global Industries flourished as he applied lessons from Kenya to humanitarian initiatives worldwide. But the real measure of success was seeing Eleanor every Saturday and slowly becoming a consistent presence in his daughter's life. 6 months after his return to Seattle, Daniel attended Eleanor's 5th birthday party, this time at a regular kids' entertainment venue rather than Edmund Thornton's estate. But the casual setting suggested Rebecca was gradually accepting Daniel as a normal part of Eleanor's life, rather than a special occasion guest. Marcus was present, comfortable and confident, but he made a point of including Daniel in conversations and activities rather than excluding him, and Daniel appreciated the maturity, even as it highlighted his own past pettiness. "She talks about you constantly," Marcus said during a quiet moment while Eleanor played with her friends. "The zoo trips, the museum visits, the stories you tell her about Kenya, you're doing great." The compliment from the man marrying Rebecca should have felt condescending, but Marcus's sincerity was undeniable. "Thank you," Daniel replied, "and thank you for being good to them both. Rebecca deserves someone who appreciates her." Marcus smiled. "She does. And for what it's worth, I think what you're doing, supporting her happiness even though it costs you, is one of the most selfless things I've witnessed. Eleanor's lucky to have you as her father." The conversation marked a turning point because Daniel realized he could either spend his life resenting Marcus for having what Daniel had thrown away, or he could appreciate Marcus for being the partner Rebecca deserved and the father figure Eleanor needed. Rebecca's wedding took place on a perfect spring morning at Edmund Thornton's estate, with cherry blossoms creating a pink canopy over the outdoor ceremony, but Daniel wasn't invited to attend because his presence would have been awkward despite everyone's best efforts at civility. Instead, Daniel spent the wedding day with Eleanor at the zoo, an arrangement Rebecca had requested so her daughter wouldn't feel divided between celebrating her mother's happiness and missing time with her father. "Mommy looks like a princess," Eleanor said, showing Daniel photos Rebecca had sent from the morning preparations. "But she said she wishes you could be happy today too." The message was characteristically thoughtful, and Daniel composed a text response. "I am happy because you're happy, and because Eleanor gets to have Uncle Marcus as part of her family. Congratulations to you both." Rebecca's reply came hours later, after the ceremony had concluded. "Thank you for that. It means more than you know." The post-wedding months brought new adjustments as Rebecca, Marcus, and Eleanor became an official family unit. But Daniel's Saturday visits continued unchanged, and gradually Eleanor began asking if she could spend some weekend nights at Daniel's apartment. "She wants to know her father's daily life," Rebecca explained when approving the first overnight visit. "But Daniel, I need to know you're ready for this responsibility." "I've been ready since the day she was born," Daniel replied, "but I was too blind to see it. I won't make that mistake again." Eleanor's first sleepover at Daniel's modest two-bedroom apartment was terrifying and wonderful, but his daughter's delight at having her own room with decorations she'd chosen herself suggested she felt safe and loved in both her homes. "This is my daddy's house," Eleanor announced to her favorite stuffed elephant, "and Mommy and Marcus's house is my other house, but I live in both places because I have two families who love me." The 5-year-old's explanation revealed Rebecca's careful work, helping Eleanor understand her unusual family structure without feeling torn between households. But it also showed Eleanor's resilience and capacity for love. 2 years after Daniel's return to Seattle, he received an unexpected invitation to dinner at Rebecca and Marcus's house. Not a handoff exchange for Eleanor, but an actual social dinner where Daniel was welcomed as family rather than tolerated as obligation. "We wanted to talk to you about something," Rebecca said after Eleanor had been put to bed, her expression serious but not unkind. "Marcus and I are expecting a baby." The announcement hit Daniel with complicated emotions: happiness for Rebecca, grief for the family he'd destroyed, but also genuine joy that Eleanor would have a sibling. "Congratulations," Daniel managed, his voice thick. "Eleanor will be an amazing big sister." "We wanted you to hear it from us before we told Eleanor," Marcus explained, "because we know this might be difficult for you, but we also want you to know that this doesn't change Eleanor's place in our family or your place in her life." The reassurance was thoughtful, but Daniel wondered if Marcus understood how thoroughly he'd replaced Daniel in every way that mattered: husband to Rebecca, father figure to Eleanor, and now biological father to the siblings Eleanor would grow up with. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said, looking directly at Marcus. "Do you ever resent that Eleanor isn't biologically yours?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "No, because she's my daughter in every way that matters. I'm the one she calls when she's scared at night. I'm teaching her to ride a bike. I'm helping with homework. Biology is just genetics. Being a father is showing up every day and choosing to love someone unconditionally." The definition was a subtle indictment of Daniel's past failures, but it was also absolutely correct, and Daniel found himself grateful that Eleanor had Marcus in her daily life, even as it pained him to acknowledge his own absence from those daily moments. "You're a good father to her," Daniel said quietly. "Better than I was when I had the chance." "You're a good father now," Marcus corrected, "and that's what matters. The past is done. We can only control how we show up today." The philosophical grace in Marcus's response revealed why Rebecca had chosen him. He was secure enough in himself to be generous toward Daniel without feeling threatened, and wise enough to recognize that Eleanor's well-being depended on all her parental figures working together. Eleanor's 7th birthday brought another milestone when she asked Daniel during one of their Saturday visits, "Daddy, why don't you live with Mommy and Marcus and me?" The question was inevitable but still difficult, and Daniel chose honesty within age-appropriate boundaries. "Because Mommy and I loved each other once, but I made some big mistakes that hurt her feelings. By the time I learned how to be a better person, Mommy had already met Marcus, who treats her the way she deserves. But even though Mommy and I aren't married anymore, we both love you very much and we work together to make sure you're happy." Eleanor processed this explanation thoughtfully. "Did you say sorry?" "Many times," Daniel confirmed. "But sometimes sorry isn't enough to fix everything. The important thing is that you have people who love you and take care of you." "I have lots of people," Eleanor agreed, counting on her fingers. "Mommy, Marcus, you, Grandpa Edmund, Margaret, Uncle James, and soon I'll have a baby brother or sister." The casual inclusion of Daniel in Eleanor's list of loved ones was a gift he'd never take for granted, and watching his daughter navigate her complex family with Such resilience filled him with pride. Rebecca gave birth to a son, Christopher Marcus Williams, when Eleanor was 7, and Daniel sent flowers to the hospital with a card that read simply, "Congratulations on your beautiful family." Rebecca's response came via text with a photo of Eleanor holding her baby brother. "She wanted you to see this. Thank you for being happy for us." The grace in Rebecca's ongoing kindness toward Daniel was humbling, but it also reflected the person she'd always been. Someone who chose compassion over bitterness, even when bitterness would have been justified. Eleanor's relationship with her baby brother became another Saturday adventure story, as she excitedly told Daniel about teaching Christopher to smile, helping with diaper changes, and singing him lullabies she'd learned from Marcus. "I'm the best big sister," Eleanor declared, with 7-year-old confidence. "And when Christopher is bigger, I'll teach him about elephants and fish and all the things you taught me." The promise to pass on Daniel's teachings to her brother suggested Eleanor saw Daniel as a valuable part of her life worth sharing, and that recognition mattered more than any professional achievement. 10 years after throwing Rebecca and Eleanor out into the snow, Daniel stood in the audience of Eleanor's middle school graduation, watching his 14-year-old daughter receive academic awards while Rebecca and Marcus beamed with pride from seats several rows ahead. Eleanor had grown into a remarkable young woman, confident, compassionate, and curious about the world in ways that reminded Daniel of both her parents, but she'd also developed her own distinct personality shaped by the loving, complex family she'd been raised in. "Dad," Eleanor called after the ceremony using the title she'd adopted around age 8, "did you see me win the science award?" "I did," Daniel replied, hugging his daughter tightly. "I'm so proud of you." Marcus approached with Christopher, now 6 years old, holding his hand, but the family dynamic had become comfortable rather than awkward through years of cooperative co-parenting. "We're taking Eleanor to dinner to celebrate," Marcus said, "and she wanted to know if you'd join us." The invitation was genuine rather than obligatory, and Daniel appreciated how thoroughly Rebecca and Marcus had worked to make him feel included in Eleanor's important moments. "I'd love to," Daniel replied, ruffling Christopher's hair, "as long as this guy promises to tell me about his soccer season." Christopher launched into an enthusiastic description of his team's victories, treating Daniel like a favorite uncle rather than his sister's other dad. And Daniel was grateful that Rebecca had raised both children to understand that families came in many configurations. Dinner was at Eleanor's favorite restaurant, a place that served both Italian food and sushi because Eleanor had inherited Rebecca's eclectic tastes. But the conversation flowed naturally without the forced politeness that had characterized early co-parenting interactions. "I've been thinking about my future," Eleanor announced over dessert, "and I want to study international development and humanitarian work in college." The declaration made Rebecca smile knowingly, while Daniel's chest swelled with pride because Eleanor had chosen to pursue the kind of meaningful work her parents had both valued at different times. "What made you interested in that field?" Marcus asked, though everyone at the table suspected the answer. "Dad's stories about Kenya," Eleanor explained, "and Grandpa Edmund's work with Meridian Global Industries charitable programs. I want to help people the way you both do, but I also want to understand why some communities need help in the first place." The nuanced answer revealed Eleanor's developing social consciousness, but it also showed how she'd synthesized lessons from multiple parental figures into her own worldview. "Whatever you choose to study, we'll support you," Rebecca said, reaching across the table to squeeze Eleanor's hand, but her eyes met Daniel's with an expression that acknowledged their daughter was becoming someone they could both be proud of. Later that night, after Daniel had returned to his apartment alone, Rebecca called unexpectedly. "I wanted to thank you." For what? Daniel asked, genuinely confused. For becoming the person Eleanor needed you to be, Rebecca replied. When you came back from Kenya 10 years ago, I wasn't sure if you'd really changed or if you were just performing change. But watching you show up consistently for her, supporting our family even when it cost you emotionally, that's real transformation. The acknowledgement meant everything because it came from the person whose opinion mattered most. But Daniel deflected. You made it possible by giving me chances I didn't deserve. We both gave each other second chances, Rebecca corrected. I got a second chance at building a healthy relationship with Marcus, and you got a second chance at being Eleanor's father. Neither of us got the original story we wanted, but maybe the stories we got were actually better. The philosophical observation was classically Rebecca, finding wisdom and hope in situations that could have been defined by regret and resentment. But Daniel wondered if she was right. His life hadn't followed the trajectory he'd once imagined. No corner office, no mansion, no traditional family, but he'd found meaningful work, genuine relationships, and most importantly, a daughter who loved him despite his failures. Thank you, Daniel said quietly, for seeing past the worst thing I ever did and recognizing that people can change. Thank you for actually changing, Rebecca replied, instead of just claiming you would. That's the difference between promises and character. The conversation ended with mutual respect that had taken a decade to build, but as Daniel lay in bed reviewing his life's trajectory, he realized Rebecca was right. This version of his story, complicated and imperfect as it was, had made him someone worthy of his daughter's love and respect. The snow outside his window reminded him of that terrible December night 14 years ago when he'd thrown away everything that mattered, but he'd learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making different choices every day until those choices became character. Eleanor would never forget that her father had once failed her mother, but she'd also grow up knowing he'd spent years proving that failure didn't define him, and perhaps that lesson that people could change through consistent action rather than empty promises was the most valuable thing Daniel could teach his daughter. The question that had haunted him for years, whether he could ever truly atone for throwing Rebecca and Eleanor into the snow, remained unanswered because some wounds never completely healed. But Daniel had learned to live with imperfect redemption and focus on being present rather than perfect. Tomorrow he'd pick up Eleanor for their Saturday tradition, maybe visit the elephant exhibit she'd loved since childhood, and continue building the relationship he'd almost destroyed, one day at a time, one choice at a time, until those accumulated choices became a life he could be proud of, despite its painful beginning.